Swen Steinberg, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow in our department here at Queen's, although this is just one of many hats that Sven wears. He is also an affiliated scholar at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., with its Pacific Regional Office at UC Berkeley. He earned his PhD from Dresden University and until 2018 was a research assistant and postdoctoral researcher there. From 2014 to 2016, he was also a postdoctoral researcher at the German Research Foundation with an affiliation at UCLA. And over the course of all of these postings, Sven has authored 3 monographs in German, published numerous articles in both German and English, edited 8 collections, as well as various special journal issues, again, both in German and English. So in other words, he's built a hugely impressive research portfolio, publishing record in his areas of specialty that include histories of migration and knowledge, forestry and mining, youth, and refugee and exile studies. And I'll also mention, I'm not covering everything that Sven has accomplished and has planned, but I will mention that he will host, he has brought to Queen's and will co-host a major conference next year, the Biennial Conference of the North American Society for Exile Studies. And the theme of that conference is Environments of Exile, Refugees, Nature, and Representation. So watch for that exciting event, September 2020. So today we'll hear from some of his latest work. His talk is entitled Of Mills and Metals, Migrant Knowledge and Modern History. So please join me in welcoming him.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting me to the seminar series here at the Department of History to present my recent project entitled Knowledge About Mountains and Woods, Discourses and Transfer Practices in Mining and Forestry, a comparison of Central Europe and North America between the 1860s and the 1960s. But before I talk a bit more especially about forestry, I will briefly outline some conceptual thoughts about the relationship between migration and knowledge in this project, which I began in 2016 with a fellowship of the German Research Foundation in connection with the University of California in Los Angeles, and then a fellowship at the German Historical Institute in Washington, which means I've collected much of the data already and started writing, and this talk gives me the opportunity to see if I'm running into the right direction. I come to the first part. I will talk a little bit more about what I mean with when I talk about migrant knowledge. So the concept of knowledge I use in my research is more broadly than it was typically the case in research produced in recent decades. I will explain the difference in a minute, but for example, the Center for the History of Knowledge in Zurich, as well as the projects at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, are mainly focused on scientific knowledge. To a certain extent, this has something to do with the sources. Peter Berg, on the other hand, introduced, especially in his What is the History of Knowledge book in 2015, but also in numerous other publications, a much wider definition, also used, for example, in the History of Knowledge project at Lund University in Sweden, the Center for Global Knowledge Studies at Cambridge University, the Stefanovic Institute on the Formation of Knowledge at the University of Chicago, or the History of Knowledge project of the German Historical Institute in Washington. So we can observe a certain dynamic in using or utilizing this knowledge approach or perspective. Drawing on ideas from anthropology, especially those introduced into historical research by specialists in colonial and global history, the concept of knowledge encompasses scholarly and scientific knowledge as well as social and everyday knowledge. It includes bodies of knowledge and knowledge orders formed through experience and in close connection with particular cultural practices. Knowledge is treated as a historical phenomenon. The overarching question is, how has knowledge been validated and recognized in different political, social, economic and cultural contexts? Adopting such a broadly conceived concept of knowledge for historical research carries the risk of declaring more or less all ways of perceiving the world and all information about it as knowledge, which would deprive the history of knowledge of its analytical precision. Is the history of knowledge the history of everything? Is a question often asked. In any event, the debate on the scope of knowledge as a frame for analysis and on how far this approach might enrich historical research in general has only just begun. The boundaries between attempts to categorize are so fluid and also so influenced by sometimes incompatible national research cultures that there cannot be talked yet of a precisely defined field of research. Moreover, it is difficult to draw a sharp distinction between knowledge and information. The two concepts are sometimes used as virtual synonyms in research, as for example in Northern America. Furthermore, Claude Lévi-Strauss widely adopted the notion of knowledge as cooked information that has been interpreted and ordered, obscures the fact that there is a subjective component to seemingly raw data and information. The decision which of all the myriad phenomena in nature or in society are to be studied or not studied is a human decision, a decision made by particular individuals with particular interests. The methods used to mine data and extract information are likewise a matter of decision. A broad distinction between objective data or information and subjective interpretation in the form of knowledge can thus be useful, but it is ultimately the specific research question the historian poses that decides where the boundary between information and knowledge falls. The broadened approach outlined a minute ago could open perspective on forms of knowledge developed and used by groups outside the academic sphere who are invisible within the conceptual framework that foregrounds science and scholarship. By examining how different forms of knowledge were deemed valid, relevant, and valuable or not, and the actors behind that process, we will be able to draw a conclusion about one's effective ideas, values, and practices that were subsequently forgotten, suppressed, or superseded. The history of knowledge does not offer a naive history of progress. Rather, it draws our attention to historical forms of secret, impeded, or ignored knowledge, to knowledge that was revalued or delegitimized, to knowledge that was stripped of its relevance or declared non-knowledge. And this brings me to a specific perspective or intersection I'm especially interested in, the intersection between migration or migrants and knowledge, because migrant knowledge often encompasses such hidden or ignored knowledge. This potentially rich field of research is in the focus of the blog Migrant Knowledge I started in the beginning of this year, and together with researchers at the German Historical Institute in Washington and its Pacific region at UC Berkeley, and it represents a first step toward drawing the contours of the field. Our subject, on the one hand, is the knowledge of migrants. That includes not only the knowledge of prominent, socially respected migrants, but also the bodies of knowledge possessed by marginalized migrant groups who have long been ignored by historians. Our focus also considers knowledge about and knowledge for migrants. And this approach can raise new questions for research on the history of migration. One, for example, might be the question of control and use of knowledge migrants bring with them. This already points toward the concepts employed in migration research today and a comprehensive understanding of migration and movement indispensable for a history of migration informed and enhanced by the history of knowledge. This breadth pertains first to the causes, reasons, and motives that prompt people to take off foreign regions and thus to leave familiar knowledge orders. The spectrum ranges, with much overlapping from voluntarily relocation to the search for new opportunities out of material need or the desire for social or cultural change to forced migration. The list of individuals and groups affected by forced migration is long, including Africans who fell victim to the slave trade, the convicts Britain sent to its penal colony in Australia, and the members of numerous political, ethnic and religious groups targeted for persecution. And the categories you can see here are only one way to categorize the different causes or reasons of migration. From a history of knowledge perspective, it is necessary, second, not to limit migration by distance. Moving from the countryside to the nearest town or city can be just as much an occasion of knowledge creation as the relocation from one continent to another, or an extended period of transit and perhaps uncertainty between home country and eventual land of settlement. Third, the concept of migration should not be too narrowly tied to the length or permanence of the change of residence. Rather, the contingency of migration needs to be taken into consideration. Clear-cut categorizations based on how long individuals or groups live outside their countries of birth or on their motivations for relocation are hardly possible and not particularly useful. Attempts at such categorization do justice neither to the complexity and performative character of migration processes, nor to the diversity of actors and the ambivalences, ambiguities of arrival. And this third aspect of permanence is related to the second, distance, too, because we can discover also circular or seasonal migration within countries and cross-border. Although nearly every form of knowledge is in motion at some point, and although knowledge rarely respects borders despite attempts to censor or suppress it, the history of knowledge has so far given little attention to migrants and migration. There have been studies of the information and data that state actors, researchers and non-state organizations have collected about migrants with an eye toward producing the knowledge needed to take political action, and more studies of this sort are in the works. Little attention has been given, however, to migrants as carriers, translators, and producers of knowledge, or to their efforts to win recognition for their foreign knowledge. This is a potentially rich area of study for the history of knowledge. Migration is marked by encounters of socially unequal knowledge agents and by conflicts over the validation and recognition of knowledge. The spectrum ranges from enthusiastic acceptance of migrants' knowledge to rejection or devaluation of foreign knowledge or of migrants' claims to expertise. Between acceptance and rejection lie myriad forms of interaction among actors to decide which knowledge might be acceptable and relevant to the receiving society or to the migrant groups involved. Those interactions are clearly pertinent to the history of knowledge. In some situations, the wide acceptance of migrant knowledge gave rise to expectations of social advance and thus provided individuals with additional incentive to migrate. Given this background, it is surprising that historians have not yet systematically studied the knowledge strategies and knowledge practices of migrant groups. There has been broad and stimulating work on knowledge transfers by cultural and intellectual elites in fields such as intellectual history, the history of exile, the history of consumption, and the history of science. Even in those fields, however, the state of research is unsatisfactory. Historical and sociological research has concentrated overwhelmingly on the meaning of the knowledge and cultural capital that migrants brought with them from their country of origin and put to use in the societies where they settled. Sociologists describe this perspective as the backpack approach. We know much less, however, about the knowledge that individuals and groups produce directly in the process of migration, or about how different forms of migration, ranging from regular travel abroad in connection with professional or networks to outright resettlement, how these different forms affected each other. In short, migrants as subjects of the history of knowledge and the change, translation and genesis of knowledge in movement from one place to another are important desiderata in the scholarly literature. And this is the frame of my picture. So I will come to the main part, and I brought you a first outline of what is supposed to be a book. Hopefully there are enough. And I will talk about this in the first part. So I come to the main part of my talk and knowledge about mountains and woods. Utilizing the approaches of the history of knowledge mentioned before, my project examines the transmission, modification and translation of knowledge related to forestry and mining, especially on the level of practical and everyday use, as well as occasions when such transmission processes failed to occur. Against the backdrop of contemporary discourses in the 19th century about romantic, sacred, and national concepts of nature or promises of industrial and economic rationality, this project critically assesses the more or less classic theme of the transatlantic exchange of scholarship and knowledge in order to sound out changes and adaptations. Although concepts, and that means in particular, for example, smelting methods in mining, forestry and forest management plans, although concepts that were developed in the 19th century, especially at German institutions, such as the Mining Academy of Freiberg and the Forestry Academy of Tarrant, and later institutions like the Forest School in Nancy or the Royal School of Mines in London became important too. Although these European concepts were initially adopted after migrating to North America, they were successively adapted to the natural as well as the social, economic and cultural conditions of North America. Such adoptions in turn then made their way back to Europe, leading to phases of exchange that were sometimes quite intensive. Both the feedback effects on Europe and the modifications remained unnoticed for a long time. In particular, in the context of research on German emigration to North America, the idea that concepts of nature utilization like the permanent forest were merely exported long held sway. As you can already see in my circulated outline, the project, however, is not limited to examining processes of knowledge acquisition or the modification of knowledge that arose in the context of migration. These can be analyzed on the basis of students, employees of government agencies like the US Forest Service or private companies, as well as on the basis of systematic excursions, forest tours, mining tours, and sources associated with them, for example, field diaries, photographs and photo albums or publications that arose in the travel context, and I will hopefully show you the potentials of this material in my talk later, focusing on American forestry students. In addition, my project also explores aspects of translation and translatability of concepts of utilizing nature, for example, in forestry and mining dictionaries, as well as the material dimension of the relevant knowledge-related exchange processes that manifested themselves, for example, in modal seed, stone collections or xylothecas. And it pays particular attention to the conflict-ridden field of the scientific professionalization of career groups that continue to engage in practical work. In the 19th and early 20th century, it was not unusual for this process to lead to disputes between the pure scientists and the practitioners who had mostly been trained by the scientists. Alongside the horizontal transatlantic level, the project explores vertical processes of knowledge transfer and modification, and hopefully demonstrates how mostly regionally and even locally developed knowledge migrated across long distances. It also shows what kind of media were significant in these migration processes and how the modification or adoption of knowledge occurred in various political, social, economic and cultural settings or failed to occur. In the following part of my talk, I will focus on one specific example from this material, the activities of the German forester Karl Alwin Schenk at a forest school he founded in Biltmore, North Carolina in 1898. What kind of approach had this early representative of professional US forestry in mind? What was the relation between the knowledge he brought about the use of the resource timber and the conditions he found in the US? Can we describe this process as a transfer, or is it rather connected to the adaptability and the inclusion of already existing bodies of knowledge? In the second step, I will focus on the activities. First step, I will try to give an answer on those questions, and in the second step, I will focus on the activities of the Biltmore Forest School, which existed from 1909 to 1914 as a forest school without campus, and on the practical training in the forests of North America and Europe. The second step is also connected to the aspect of transfer, or more precisely to modifications and adaptations of environmental knowledge negotiated during and after a very specific migration constellation. As I've already mentioned, the professionalization and academization of the use of the renewable resource timber or wood began in Europe in the early 19th century. And as a result of colonialism, this process was early inter- and transnational. In 1878, for example, the German forester Dietrich Brandis founded in Dehradun, India, a forest school for the British colonial administration. North America was not exempted from these processes as a result of the immigration of foresters. European forestry knowledge, for example, about cultivation methods, pests or tree species, has already arrived in North America in the end of the 19th century. At the same time, however, with the help of European councillors such as Brandis, the US Forest Service also created new structures for the state administration of the resource wood and started setting up forest schools as training facilities for precisely this administration. Karl Alwin Schenk, former assistant of Brandis and employed in 1898 in Biltmore as manager of the forests of George Vanderbilt, has been perceived for a long time as a figure of transfer in this process. He has been hired to bring German principles to the US, wanted to implement them and failed. Already before the First World War, we can discover the trend to divide between North American forestry and especially German management concepts, since the German methods of monocultures in same-age stand were increasingly rejected in the US as unaesthetic. Mockingly, American foresters spoke of German or even of Prussian forestry. A closer look, however, shows that this national classification as German, used by contemporaries, covered one of the processes I'm interested in. Schenk adopted the situation in the US forests and developed a strategy of forest management by not simply using specific methods and approaches from Germany and Europe, but by observing the conditions that he found in North Carolina and adjusting the methods he knew. And there were certainly contemporaries who took note of this mixture. Samuel Dana, for example, wrote in November 1908 on behalf of the Forest Service to a regional forester, nearly all of the forestry methods employed in this country are modifications or adaptations of German methods, while at the same time German methods are seldom used here as they are practiced abroad. Schenk came quickly to the conclusion that especially the German state-oriented system of forest management was hardly applicable in the United States. The forest areas were simply too large and needed therefore investments, wood consumption was much higher, and the timber import too. That's why Schenk identified private forestry as a starting point where he believed modern forms of sustained forest management should be implemented. And that this implementation could only take place with trained personnel. Still in the year of his employment in 1998, he founded the Biltmore Forest School as the first training facility of this kind in the US. One of his lectures, published in 1907 and thus accessible to a larger public, shows how strongly he considered the necessity of modification and adaptation. Imagine for a moment the famous Black Forest of Germany were transferred with its fine spruce woods, its splendid roads, and its skilled laborers into the heart of the Adirondacks? Would it be wise financially to continue its silvicultural treatment as inaugurated in Germany? It certainly would, was one answer Schenk gave to this question, because the timber would sell equally well, and much more centrally, a network of splendid roads would tend to cheapen transportation. On the other hand, the same black forest transferred to the Pacific coast in the Olympic Mountains would certainly prove a financial and therefore a silvicultural failure. And he explained this especially with the necessary government investments, for example, in roads, and that would require as a cultural forest, as he would call it. That's why he recommended a gradual transition and the acquisition of appropriate experience in the forests themselves, the adoption of local forestry knowledge, and no rapid and comprehensive change to new, possible even imported methods. Forest knowledge acquired as experience already points to a form of knowledge transfer in Biltmore. Schenk did not want to teach his approach, which he also called conservative forestry, in the lecture hall, but at the place of application. Forest knowledge as environmental knowledge could only be acquired or had to be acquired in the forest. This set the school apart from other, more scientific-oriented forest schools such as Cornell or Yale, founded in 1899 and 1900, where the Biltmore students were mockingly called lumberjacks and not foresters. However, the forms of forest management developed in Biltmore and influenced by European concepts should have a decisive impact on the US Forest Service founded in 1905. Many Biltmoreans started their career as regional or state foresters and not in private timber enterprises. Schenk's school had as many as 361 students by 1914, but the practical training was not limited to the forests around Biltmore. Already in 1900, Schenk told his former supervisor Brandis that he was teaching his students the, quote, necessity of a good knowledge of German. In Biltmore and at the beginning also in Yale and Cornell, German played also a role in training because certain manuals were not available in an English translation or were not easily transferable because of specific conceptual terminologies. But Schenk justified the knowledge of the German language with a further argument. German is particularly an advantage for the student who, quote, wishes to profit by visiting forests in Germany. Schenk himself adopted this concept of gaining knowledge through temporal migration from Brandis himself, who had sent his students from Dehradun in India for training purposes to European forests too. Vice versa, foresters of this school were also interested in European forestry methods. I just brought one example that highlights this Bulgarian forestry in India. This is of course another topic, but it shows processes of knowledge circulation that were connected to migration. So Schenk had already planned training tours through German and European forests, which then became the core concept of his forest school from 1909 onwards. In summer 1909, Vanderbilt terminated the contract with Schenk after a dispute. Vanderbilt cut it clear a part of his forest for economic reason, a forest that Schenk sought to manage in a mixed-age stand, and when you clear-cut this forest, the whole forest management concept is gone. And this school and his forest school was, so Schenk was fired and the school was closed too. But the school continued to exist until 1914 without a fixed location. Instead, Schenk designed a one-year training program funded by student fees, private donations, and his own savings. In rented Pullman wagons, the first group of 45 US students drove to forests in Wisconsin and Michigan in the fall of 1909 and worked in sawmills and timber companies. In the spring, the group went to the Adirondacks and southern Appalachians in North Carolina, to Tennessee in the summer. The 4 winter months, however, the group spent in Germany and set up their winter quarters in Schenk's hometown Darmstadt. From here, in the afternoon, The Hessian forests, as well as sawmills and timber companies were visited. Schenk held in German in the morning his later published lectures, and the University of Darmstadt, as well as the local botanical garden, was used for specific training, for example, on microscopes. At the same time, Darmstadt was a starting point because the groups of US students also visited forests in Prussia, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, as well as in Switzerland and France. In August 1913, Schenk already planned until October 1915. In 1914, however, only 6 students enrolled, so he closed his school without campus, and the outbreak of the First World War made this closure a final one. But how did these students perceive what they saw? Did they consider practices and concepts as useless from the outset? What did they care about anyway? Or did the students adopt these concepts, for example, with regard to their prior knowledge of American practices? I can find answers to these questions in my material, mainly on the basis of 2 groups of sources. On the one hand, in the field diaries of these students, preserved in the collection of the North Carolina State University in Raleigh, and on the other hand, in labeled photo albums of the participants of these forest tours from the collections of the Yale Forest School and the Forest History Society in Durham, North Carolina. 3 of these field diaries, as well as published articles of the participants of the forest tours, are the basis of the following last section of my talk. In summer 1910, Howard Grinbill, a Biltmore Store student and participant of the 1909-10 course, summarized 10 fields that were of particular interest during a visit of German forests: forest management, silviculture, classification and distribution of the forest in the United States, botanical studies, forest protection, timber preservation, utilization of timber products, forest economics, fish and game course, and finally, American export and lumber trade with Germany. The focus was therefore broad, but in some cases linked to specific American interests. Homer D. House, who had traveled to Germany with Carl Alvin Schenk and his students in 1913, described this breadth. In 1915, he wrote about his experiences and the forest knowledge acquired here. The German forests present an almost endless variety of conditions with respect to management and utilization, and the observant forester will find therein much food for thought in connection with forest conditions which prevail at home, and he will discover therein many new ideas that will be of benefit to him in coping with American problems in forestry. What sounded not like an adoption but more like a transfer turned out to be a bit different in practice. For example, when Schenk spoke about the European method timber in a lecture in November 1909, the student Theodor Jones noted in his field diary, quote, "It would be impossible to do this in the US." In general, the method of comparison played an essential role, which, this is at least my impression, was central to the processes of adoption described here. American students came to Germany with specific prior knowledge from the US, and because of their education in Schenk's lectures, they also knew already the methods used here, but only in practice they did recognize the differences, the advantages and disadvantages, as well as their applicability. For example, in a forest near Heidelberg, Jones noted, unlike the States, only the bark of young trees was peeled, never old. And when visiting a Darmstadt furniture factory in December 1909, he noted that the wood was, quote, piled just as it comes from the log, not scattered into different grades as we do it in the US. As you can see on the slide, the depiction also played a role. The documentation of the acquisition of knowledge was based primarily on sketches and later on also on photographs. A few days later, as another example, Jones noted that the Darmstädter pheasantry, the group had the luck to witness one of the German methods of tree felling, which he then described in detail, and with a drawing, under the drawing he also recorded the pros and cons. And the latter were clearly differentiated from the question of whether it was a German method or not. Its applicability was tied to aspects such as speed or ground conditions. They also found similar findings in a Darmstadt sawmill that worked slower than mills that the group had previously seen in the US, but the work, quote, is very well done and very cheap. The latter refers to the economic aspects of the observed methods, which were also repeatedly noted. For example, when visiting a plantation of Weymouth pines in Griesheim in December 1909, Jones compared the method of sowing with that one he knew from Biltmore and noted that this method used in Hesse, Germany, was more profitable. He also noted which tree species had previously been on the ground. And when he visited a forest near Wolfskalen in January 1910, he did not simply describe the utilization method, but developed, with regard to cultivation methods, and especially species that he knew from the US, an alternative management plan. Of particular interest for the groups and for Schenk, who planned and prepared these visits, was the research already being done on tree species that were native and farmed in North America. The practical benefit of daily fieldwork, especially in this forest in Germany, was obvious, and this specific regional knowledge was valued. In Weinheim, for example, Theodore Jones was able to visit one of the first places in Europe in 1909 where, quote, American species have been planted. And Howard Grinville recorded this excursion in 1910, quote, Germany has the world's best experimental plots of American trees and world's oldest varieties of American trees, notably of white pine, Douglas fir, sequoia, and so on. A special emphasis laid on the principle of afforestation and thinning, whereby specific German methods were used. However, this was also not just about the mere acquisition of knowledge. Rather, in Jones' diary, we can also find the application or a reflection on the practices in the United States. For example, when he found out while visiting a Mannheim timber importer that American hardwood played no role, and explained this by the nature of sawing. In comparison to German as well as Russian and Swedish methods, he wrote, our sawing could be greatly improved. This form of adoption by comparison and the consideration of different methods can be found again and again in the field diaries. Milton Lockwood noted, for example, in 1913, this business of planting directly, so often found in Hesse-Darmstadt, does not appeal to me, so Dietrich Brandis' method appeals to me more. In a forest near Darmstadt in November 1912, he had also seen the finest stand of second growth beech, the finest stand I've ever seen in Germany, in which, however, numerous branches were not blended and left dead on the trunk. And he noted that, a little bit surprised, that this was apparently the policy here in Germany. This knowledge acquired and adopted in Germany and in Europe was applied or passed on in different ways. Of course, the first and most comprehensible way was its publication. Participating students, such as Howard Grinville, published their experiences, always in connection with the already mentioned photographs, which I classify in my project as a bearer of a specific knowledge, because excitingly they partly document a selective perception of what the photo author considered to be German forest knowledge or even German forestry. These publications never actually argued with the mere transfer. Homer D. House, for example, emphasized in 1915 that it was necessary to develop scientific and practical forestry in the US that would resemble German methods. So he used the word resemble, not something like transfer or a similar term. For the already quoted almost endless variety of conditions with regard to management and utilization American foresters could find, especially in Germany, to solve problems in their own forests, he had made a choice. In 1915, he presented, and I quote, sketches taken at random from my notes with a view of presenting characteristic and interesting methods of procedures in silvicultural management and utilization. Howard Grinville emphasized already in 1910 that the goal of traveling through German forests forest was not that the American students would bring along what they had simply learned. It was not about to introduce any innovation upon their return. Finally, the perfect forestry system, Trimble wrote, is not more suitable for the exploitation of the vast areas of American timber than American lumbering methods are applicable to the communal forests of Germany. According to Trimble, again quote, the world's best working field of scientific studies can be found in central and southern Germany. This applies in particular to the experience with the American Weymouth pine, but, quote, for practical work in timber cruising, road, bridge and railroad building, logging and milling, the southern Appalachians and the forests in the lake states of the United States form desirable working fields. A short conclusion. In my opinion, the example of the Biltmore Forest School can show especially three things or three fields. First, processes that can be revealed when we look through the lens of the history of knowledge. So my material shows much less a transfer of German forestry concepts, but from the beginning and with Schenk's arrival in the US, modification and adaptation or adjustment to the partly completely different conditions. And this was not only limited to species or aspects like climate, but above all to economic aspects such as ownership or aesthetic debates. Second, the example shows not only the adaptation or the reflection offered by contemporaries, but above all the places where it took place. These places were located on the practical level and settled in the field and in the forest, and were not limited to classical forms of knowledge exchange and publications or the professional scientific institutions. The Biltmore boys acquired and adopted this knowledge in managed forests, not in the lecture hall or in the artificial arboretum. Here we can again differently think about forms of the translation of practical knowledge, in my case about tree species, forms of thinning and sawing, the extraction of specific raw materials such as turpentine, or dealing with pest infestations acquired regarding to the possible application. Numerous remarks in the field diaries I have analyzed indicate this. And those findings are not limited to this specific case and the years 1909 to 1913. This brings me to my third and last point. Since these processes took place during migration, or more precisely, they were made possible by migration in the first place, the example of the forest school without a campus shows us also the potentials of thinking about migration and knowledge as one lens, not least because the Biltmore case is not an isolated one. I could identify these tours through forests in Europe and in North America again and again in my material, especially between 1900 and 1940. In 1909, for example, Raphael Sonn was commissioned by the US Forest Service on a European tour. He had the task of taking series for the photo collection of the Forest Service, for example, about, quote, German forest extension practices. These pictures were used in the publications of the Forest Service and as slide series for education and training. We can observe these processes also elsewhere in education and at the American forest schools. The photo album of a European field trip of the Yale forester Arthur Bernard Regnagel from 1914 was used, for example, at the Yale Forest School for Teaching. This album is also interesting because in addition to the documentation of specific techniques of forestry, it contains translated forms from the German and French forest administration. I could discover these photo albums paired with field diaries as a serial source in numerous collections in the United States, and this development did not stop due to the First World War. Schenk organized European forestry tours also in the 1920s that produced another amount of such sources, and between 1932 and 1937 the Carl Schurz Memorial Foundation in Philadelphia organized an exchange program and financed 45 US American individuals and 3 group trips Every year, a group of 20 to 25 German foresters came vice versa to the US, as well as individual scientists, timber traders, private and state foresters. And in summer 1934, the key figure in German colonial forestry, Franz Heske, was invited by the Scholz Foundation for a lecture trip to the US and held numerous talks throughout the country, and especially for regional foresters, in particular on aerial forestry. At that point, I will not delve back in my very exciting material. This is more to underline my plea to think about migration and knowledge as something related. The agency of migrants in processes of knowledge production, translation and circulation, and about knowledge as a perspective in general for historical research or even in general. Thank you.
Okay, great. So yeah, there's coffee that is So Sven will moderate some questions.
Yes, please.
Does your study look at the point when migrant knowledge becomes host-nation knowledge? In other words, you talk there about German forestry practices being adapted to the US conditions. So I imagine eventually the American students stopped talking about German practices and they became American practices. Do you look at sort of that transition point?
Yes, this is at least part of the material because this happens. So these field diaries are an exciting source because for this particular group they were coming with a specific body of knowledge. They knew the forestry practices in the US, they also knew something about Europe, and then they were in the field. And sometimes they started modifying also methods they knew from the US. And I have similar examples in field diaries of miners. So this is the other part of the project I haven't talked so much today about. And I have a very nice example. This exchanges were mostly mounted a little bit different. So those were mostly US Americans who studied at mining academies in Europe, and then they came back. So this moving around through forests is some specific form I could only identify in the forestry part. But then these miners came back, for example, with specific knowledge in silver smelting. They gained in Freiberg, was one of the focal points there, and then they went to Nevada in the 1860s and realized that this smelting concepts or processes do not work because the quality of the silver, quality of the coal is different. And what they then do, they modify the concepts they knew back from Freiberg. So he modifies in his field diary so-called Freiberg barrel, which is a smelting oven at least, and adjusted it as to the needs.
I was reading the first couple sentences of the Krinville article, and he starts by discussing Germany as the foremost military power in the world, and then gets into the naval power. And I mean, obviously, Schrank's school was sort of never reopened after the First World War. Having had ancestors who served in the forestry corps in Canada, is there something in particular about this geopolitical intersection, this time frame, that's militaristic about forestry in specific?
Yes, this is pretty much interrelated. And if you are interested, I can send you an article I published 2 or 3 years ago about just as an example to show you this, about the 10th Engineers. It was an engineer battalion of the US Army, and the 10th Engineers were 20,000 foresters and lumberjacks, and they were sent to southern France in the fall of 1917. And they cut it down in 1 year, forests in the size of Belgium. So they had a huge impact on French forestry behind the front lines. And this was for the supply of the military, and wood timber is used nearly everywhere. Planes, rifles, the whole trench warfare. Paper for propaganda is timber-based, and so on. So yes, the military use of this specific forest knowledge plays always a role, especially in the two wars. And it is also part of the colonial thinking and colonial planning. So colonial forestry is something that has been developed in Germany already in the 19th century, and this was pretty much interesting for researchers, for example, at the Yale Forest School, who were thinking, let's say in bigger spaces, just to have a look what are the concepts the Germans use. And many of these colonial planners in forest Germany ended up then, after 1939, in Poland and organized the occupied Polish forest management and gaining this resource for the German military there as well. So again, yes, there is a strong connection between military and forestry.
I have a kind of a piggyback question to that, but moving out of the board back a little bit. As you talk about the knowledge, the movement of knowledge with migration, what's the role of both the state in all of this? Because we have the U.S. Forest Service, complementary organizations in Europe, but also of capital, right? Because I realize that Biltmore is Vanderbilt's personal estate, but Vanderbilt is Vanderbilt, and the Adirondacks, again, management of the Adirondack Forest is heavily influenced by Rockefeller, not the forester, but he's interested in forming the park, so there's kind of this state capital overlap. So can you talk a little bit about the state and capital in this?
Also a big question and a big difference compared to many European countries, and especially to France and Germany, because this is quite differently organized. So at some point in my talk, I mentioned that Schenk realized that he has to start not with this stately run forestry concepts, but he has to start in private forestry.
That's where my question came from. I was like,
and at some point he realized that the private owners of forestry lands in the US have to be convinced to manage these forests in a planned, sustainable way. So the problem with this is the profit is much lower. This was at least the problem. And Schenk tried to prove at the Vanderbilt estate that it is even possible to run a forest with profit. In the end he failed because Vanderbilt cut it all down and sold the timbers, and it doesn't went out well, but there is at least a whole discourse going on, and it's not only about Schenk. So there are much more prominent figures very close to Roosevelt I, like Gifford Pinchot, for example. Henry Solon Graves plays a major role, so he's the first head of the Yale Forest School, and they try, let's say, influence the public opinion about it, and they used not so much the economic arguments, that was also connected to the conservation movement arguments. So this is, and at that point, this is also related to national parks and this discourses going on, and preserving nature and sustainable managed forests, that was their argumentation, is a way also of preservation. So and it's kind of a development. It's not so easy to answer. I found, for example, the Weyerhaeuser company interesting. They were running huge forests in Oregon and Portland, and they developed close contacts to southern France, where this concept of pine plantations was used. And this was also something that was rejected before the First World War, this Prussian forestry thing, where the trees stand in a line. But they at least imported as well this the specific knowledge from southern France. So they hired regional and local foresters from France to run this business in Portland and Oregon. So this is a private initiative at least.
and Weyerhaeuser's pulp and paper, right?
Say again?
Your pulp and paper.
Yeah, they are pulp and paper as a company, but they were running also huge forest areas.
Pulp comes from someplace.
So, and the state is sometimes involved and sometimes not. So that's the answer to this part of the question. When you look into this primarily outline, you will find the state not so much. So in Germany, for example, education, training, universities are mostly regional, organized and financed in the 19th century. There is a ministry on the federal level that was established, I think, in the 1920s, very late. They were then, after 1933, and when raw materials from the German perspective, especially after the fourth-year plan, were more and more interesting to German planners, they were pretty much interested in international connections. So I found in this context, it's Reichsforstrat, for example, a planned excursion to Canada. Not a big surprise, Karl Alvin Schenk was sent over to Canada to explore if there is any connection to make with private timber companies from Canada and German, the German timber industry, and he was sent by the state to explore this. So this is kind of one of those interrelations where we can find it. But I saw more private initiatives. I saw the initiatives of forest schools, of foundations. Rockefeller plays also a role in the 1920s in financing people who were getting over to Europe to gain specific bodies of knowledge, and not so much this, the state as an actor in these processes.
I just had a question about gender and knowledge transfers, because like I know that forestry continues to be like a very masculine industry. So I guess like to what extent were the discourses of forestry knowledge gendered, and were these like masculinized frameworks of knowledge a point of connection between like American and German foresters?
The answer is yes. This is I tell you a white male story full of ignorance. That's what I summarize it, because of course in North America there is already knowledge on the ground about forests, so you need also information about soil and so on. This is already there, but it has been simply ignored. And the people who are conducting this are all male. And the male thing plays a role, for example, in student self-organizations and fraternities, because those were the starting points of networks that worked then later on, for example, in the US Forest Service, but it's the same in Germany and Europe. And so this is what I could observe. I don't remember that I ever found a female student on a forestry school in the period I was looking at. So there were at the beginning, in the early mining schools in the US, surprisingly there were women, but only for the first 4 or 5 years. And they were mostly trained in drawing. So they were not trained to get into the mines with the hammer and do this work. Masculinity is a good question. I have to think about this. I mean, this male networks contain this already. This is already there, but it doesn't really play a role in this knowledge acquiring processes. The only thing that comes to my mind is the CCC in the US, the Conservation Corps, after or connected to the New Deal, because there is a rarely similar organization in Germany. This is also for bringing people into work, but the German version is with a lot more ideology and not so much freedom and lots of uniforms and medals and this kind of stuff. So German way, and they are especially also interested in this. But again, those are pure male organizations. So yeah, maybe a good advice to look at it. Thank you. Ariel.
I was just going to ask again, perhaps in a different way, about the sort of valorization of German knowledge during this time period. So the valorization of German knowledge, because the Germans are in the American Academy, the Germans are part, as we've learned, of the Indian colonial effort as experts. So that's on one side, and the other side is a sort of, perhaps, Americanists can chime in, this notion, thinking about works like Cronin's work on Nature's Metropolis, a new awareness perhaps of the finiteness of these resources sort of converging at a certain point. The reality of the finiteness, since many accessible forests have already been cut down, and not in a systematic fashion in the building of cities like Chicago. So I'm wondering whether there's some sort of convergence there in the broader intellectual, epistemological way.
Not that I'm aware of. So one of the natural philosopher, I would say, is Aldo Luthot in North America. So he plays a huge role in these debates. There is not a single person I find on the other side of the Atlantic. There's no such thinker of nature, philosophy, and even society. This is in Germany a much more nationalistic discourse. So the rooted Germanness is connected to the oak tree, and this we will find this kind of discourse. But I don't see this exchange on this intellectual level about, I don't know, what is the world or how can we...
Yeah, but I'm not even talking about that, but I'm just saying that there's this moment, maybe a conjunctural moment, not a zeitgeist, but, conjunctural moment where there's, the Germans in universities as bearers of expert knowledge, which valorizes German knowledge as such, right?
Yeah.
And then this economic, threshold that is being passed as the most accessible force. No, so no problem.
Your case study is a study of knowledge exchange between two societies that, in the context of 1910 or thereabouts, the turn of the century, are both considered sort of equal on the global scale of civilization. If we could put together white countries, they're developed countries, and so forth. I'm wondering if you have done work that has given you any sort of indication about whether the processes are of sort of equal exchange and mutual adaptation would be operating in the same way if you were talking about exchange with, say, India or Chile or something like that.
No, they would not. I'm sure about it. So many of the US foresters, or many of the leading figures in the US Forest Service, just as an example to illustrate this, were mainly involved in the founding of the forestry branch of the Food and Agriculture Organization. So in 1944 they started already to organize them internally, and then they have this their own paper and so on. And then after the war was over, they tried to make this forestry branch an international organization. They wanted to have everybody involved, and especially the members from the global south, from India, for example, they were highly skeptical of what was going on, and then they rejected to work in this forestry branch because they had the impression that the FAO only organizes the timber supply of the northwestern hemisphere. So this is a good example for these inequalities that we can discover in this story. And yes, you are right. So this has something to do with the social recognition or the national recognition and this kind of things. I mean, the First World War is a break. So, for example, at Yale they stopped teaching German. So this is also a break for further knowledge transfers or gaining knowledge, because the students weren't able to read the German book because they learn German and use it at least this specific scientific literature. But then they restarted because they realized they need to know what is going on in Germany, what is the state of the art in research, for example, also in the mining sector, coal research and this kind of things that were going on in Germany. On the other hand, I mean, this is also always related to the specific needs. So the Americans as well as the Germans and / Europeans, it's kind of floating a little bit around in my project, they were also going to the places where they were interested in, where there was research conducted on specific topics. And there is a shift after the First World War, and this is my point, that the Americans started more to look into Scandinavia. And this is because of the forest fires. So there is no specific knowledge on forest fires, for example, in Germany, because the forest is also small. You have a lot of roads, so you can easily get rid of this. But the Scandinavians, for example, in Finland, they have the same problems as the Americans get with this specific problem with forests. And there is a real exchange about, I don't know, what to do using planes and so on and so on. Area forestry plays a major role in observation and society.
So my question is specifically about circulation of knowledge and forestry. I must preface this by saying that my knowledge is cursory and accidental on this. But my sense is that in a broader, wider scale, circulation of knowledge and forestry is more a government endeavor than a scientific endeavor. If you look at the colonial world, it's mostly state-sponsored. Migration doesn't seem to play any role whatsoever in circulation of forestry knowledge in the wider world in the 20th century. Given that, does this therefore become a very specific and unique case that you are talking about in the circulation of knowledge and forestry? And therefore, is it possible for you to decouple migration from knowledge within the example that you just made?
Yes, that's possible, of course. That is what I tried to introduce at the beginning of my talk. So this project is having at least two perspectives. The one perspective is this horizontal, transatlantic, whoever is on the way. But I'm also interested in the vertical level, because people that were, for example, trained in forest schools, it's the same in the US as it is in Europe, most of them did not stay in academia. They went out as foresters into forests, and there is a specific discourse between these two groups. So you have, for example, in the scientific journals, you have in the end mostly this letter to the editor section. It's very interesting because there you have, this is not connected to migration, it's only connected to knowledge. There you have letters from foresters who went out into the forests, and then they try to use a sort of a management plan or a utilizing concept, and then they found out it doesn't work because of wind conditions in this specific spot and so on. So this is in detail, it's complicated. It's a complicated thing. The other question is interesting. I would say, or my impression is that things are changed rapidly after the Second World War. So this exchange processes became also under the umbrella of the FAO, already talked about, much more denationalized. And my impression is this triggered, or this is also related to migration processes that were no longer necessary. So because you have international publication fora, before the Second World War, you have the German literature and the American one, and there's no overarching German journal, for example, for world forestry. There is a German one, but it is a German one, so not an international one. I would say this is somehow connected, but again, you have migration processes in forestry also in the global south already before the First World War. That is what Dietrich Brandis, what I mentioned, organized in Dehradun. So then you have to be careful of who is moving around. So that were, of course, people from Britain for the colonial administration, but there were also people from India who were trained in Dehradun, but they were also trained in the European forests. So it's very interesting constellation, but again, I would say migration and circulation of knowledge is also there in forestry much earlier. So in the regions you are talking about. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And maybe I missed something in it, in your explanation. This talk strikes me as it's dealing a lot with the migration or circulation and movement of knowledge through these exchanges, through these tours, through various mechanisms. When you say migrant knowledge, kind of evoking, especially since you had the list of some of the categories of forced migrants, refugees, labor migration. I was wondering, is there any part of your project that would focus on what it evoked for me, which was much more of a kind of subaltern kind of knowledge of practice by people, who are, maybe labor migrants, for example. So miners coming from parts of, I don't know, Newcastle, northern England, and they migrate to the U.S. and then they're working in, I don't know, western Pennsylvania, etc. Just at the level below the sort of scientific construction of and study of practices, because otherwise it seems to me it's very much like resource management in industrial capitalist society. So is there something, what would you make the case for the migrant kind of component of it?
I mean, this question is pretty much related to two sources, right?
Yes.
There are many people on the move in the late 19th century and 20th century, especially related to industrial developments, immigration to North America, and so on. But when it comes to this processes I'm interested in, the modifications and so on, we are not talking anymore about the ordinary migrants. So I don't find so far sources that could tell me anything about an ordinary knowledge who is working in a forest, for example, managed by someone who was trained in Germany, and what happens then. So I cannot say much about this specific constellation. So to a certain extent, this project remains an elite-focused one somehow, and I'm pretty much aware of that. But I do not see how I can change this. What I mentioned before in the answer to Amitav solves this question a little bit, but again, trained forester, the forest school, is not somebody who I would categorize as ordinary anymore. There's another part, or it might be related to your question, this remains still open to me as well. This is the course of migration related to processes of knowledge production during and after migration. So my migrants are mostly self-willed ones, not so much forced migration in this story. Finally, I talked to Roseanne and others already about it. Finally, I found a good example, and I will see what I can do with it. This is after the, just summarize, some people know the story already. After the Hungarian uprising in '55, the entire forest school of Sopron, the professors and the students fled the country to Austria, and they were relocated at UBC in Vancouver. So, and I found a newspaper coverage in the Life magazine, picture these young fellows sitting around the table doing something, and the caption says, those are young Hungarian foresters using European crop methods. And this is, at that point I stumbled, I said, what are they exactly doing? And they do this in British Columbia. What's the impact? Many of them went into the forest service, is their own relationship, but this is a good example for forced migration, because this was literally not planned for long.
I think this is a really interesting talk. I wonder if you could say, you talked, the adaptations as this forestry knowledge became these migrants to the United States. In both cases, this is an economic resource from a military resource, and we can understand the modifications that are made because of conditions, right? Conditions, whether those are have to do with the way the forests are owned or the natural environment. You mentioned at a couple of points aesthetics, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how different visions of the forest might have shaped responses to these, and how these aesthetic visions, how do you locate them or how do you research them?
I mean, this is especially in North America, this discourses about the forest aesthetics is closely related to the conservation movement and this point. So this is summarized, has something to do with wilderness. So American foresters preferred mixed, mostly, not all, and it makes a big difference between Portland and North Carolina and so on. So you have to keep in mind that forestry is something regional. And by the way, Paul Cheng wrote in the 1920s there is no such thing like German forestry because it looks pretty much different in Prussia and in the Black Forest. So this is what you have to keep in mind when you think about aesthetics. But those fellows at the very beginning in the US, they preferred mixed forests, which means mixed natures and mixed species. And when you think about the forest, how the forest looks like, then compared to Caspar David Friedrich's monoculture, you can easily find out the differences in this aesthetic questions. In Germany, this whole thing changed during interestingly during the First World War, because there was a huge scarcity after the First World War. Timber was part of the Treaty of Versailles and part of the reparations. And in the 1920s, the Germans also changed to a concept what the Americans called industrial forestry. And this is tree plantation, fast-growing trees. Trees could be harvested in a very short period, and this changed at least also how forests look like, but there was not a huge debate in an aesthetic way, because it was simply the need for forest, for timber. This came, there has been a debate after 1933 until 1936 in Germany about this specific form, because of course National Socialism and nature is interrelated in a specific way. I already mentioned German rootedness and this kind of things, but after the 4th-year plan, this debate was ended, because it became quite clear that this forest had to be utilized for rearmament, for Germany being a world power again. So this is always part of the story, but yeah, and in the end it's a decision that were made, yeah, focused on specific needs and so on. And again, I mean, even people like Gifford Pinchot, who have a close relationship to this aesthetic question, so conservation movement and so on, even he said, at some points, it makes economically sense to clear-cut a whole forest, to clear-cut every tree down because of economic reasons. So this is, there's some sort of a conflict with the economic part of the story also.
Oh, sorry. Who are we gonna?
One.
Probably the anyway. I have a philosophical question, actually. And I was I'm actually really intrigued by this idea of knowledge is based on interpersonal relationships, right? Because migration is all about movement of people and the ideas that come with them, right? So it challenged their abstract understanding that you could read about a German forest versus go into a German forest, or read about an American forest versus actually experiencing it. And this whole mobile campus thing, I think, was all about that, right? That to know something isn't to read about it or to exchange sort of verbal ideas, but rather to have a kind of multi-sensory experience. And so experience is related to knowledge, but also interpersonal relationships. You talk about comradeship, living together, experiencing together, right? Developing these bonds as key to knowledge transfer. So I'm wondering if you have any aspect, you've discussed this in your project about how this sort of validates that entire way of seeing knowledge as experience.
I would agree. Knowledge and experience are closely related, especially in my case. But, and this is what I try to do with this book, someday a book. I will also look on different forms that are connected to migration and knowledge, but not only to people. That's why I showed you in the beginning these mining models. Because in this specific case, you have a mostly regional or local knowledge about smelting processes set up somewhere in Saxony or Bavaria. And then the Columbia School of Mines in New York bought all of these mining models from this workshop of this mining academy in Germany. And at that point I raised the question, okay, why would they do that? And what did they do with these models? And at this point, this is not so much about experience and the personal thing. So it's the same with the photographs, at least. So there was, I had this example of this article of a guy who was already in Germany, and for a publication he used a photograph another person from the US Forest Service made a couple of years before. So, and this is also connected to migration, but not so much to the personal experience, because he was never in this specific forest. He used a photograph. So that's why, yeah, it's interesting.
Okay, great, thanks for that presentation.
Yeah, thanks to you.
So,
I will indeed.